Governor Thomas Mayhew the Elder established the first English settlement of Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket and adjacent islands in 1642. He is one of the editors of the Base Arm Book, the first book published in British North America. His assistant Peter Foulger was the grandfather of Benjamin Franklin. Biography. Thomas Mayhew was born in Tisbury, in the county of Wiltshire in England. He married Anna Parkhurst, born about 1600, in Hampshire, England, daughter of Matthew Parkhurst. In 1621 they had a son, Thomas, the younger, baptized in Hannah's hometown of Southampton. 2 years later they had another child, Robert Mayhew, baptized in Tisbury. The family left England in 1631 halves during the Great Migration of Puritans that brought 20,000 settlers to Massachusetts in 13 years. Through the agency of Matthew Craddock of London, Mayhew had been appointed to manage properties in Medford, Massachusetts, and to engage in trade and shipbuilding. In or about 1633, Mayhew's wife Anna died, and about 1634 he returned to England for a business meeting with Craddock. While in England, he married Jane Gallion, and brought her back to New England with him. The daughter Hannah was born in 1635, and 3 more daughters, Mary, Martha, and Bethia, followed. Martha is the world-famous singer and songwriter Taylor Swift's 7th great-grandmother. In 1641, Thomas secured Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, the Elizabeth Islands, and other islands as a proprietary colony from Sir Ferdinando Gorges and the Earl of Stirling. This enabled him to transfer his business operations there. With the help of his son Thomas, a settlement was established and farming and whaling enterprises were begun. The Mayhews had great success in regard to Indian policy. Because of the fair treatment of the Indians there, the colony was protected from the bloodshed that occurred elsewhere in King Philip's War. In 1646, the General Court of Massachusetts directed the religious leaders of the colony to select 2 among them to serve as missionaries to the natives. So great was the interest aroused by this venture that a society was formed in England also to support the missionaries. Unfortunately, a massive conflict broke out, called King Philip's War, which resulted in many deaths of both the settlers and the natives. However, 3 prominent names appear. They are John Eliot, Thomas Mayhew, and Eleazar Wheelock, who established Dr. Wheelock's Academy for the promotion of Christianity and civility among the savage Indians of this continent. In 1657, the younger Thomas Mayhew was drowned when a ship he was traveling in was lost at sea on a voyage to England. Mayhew's 3 grandsons, Matthew Mayhew, Thomas, John Mayhew, and other members of his family assisted him in running his business and government. Colonizing Dukes County. In 1641, while engaged in business ventures in the vicinity of Boston, Mayhew succeeded in acquiring the rights to the islands that now constitute Dukes County and Nantucket County, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and the Elizabeth Islands. He bought the county for £40 and 2 beaver skin hats from William Alexander, the 2nd Earl of Stirling. To resolve a conflicting ownership claim, he also paid off Sir Ferdinando Gorges, thereby acquiring a clear title. Mayhew established himself as governor of Martha's Vineyard in 1642 and sent his son, Thomas the Younger, with about 40 English families to settle there. He himself followed 4 years later. Together he and the younger Thomas established Martha's Vineyard's first settlement and called it Great Harbor, now Edgartown. Relations with the natives. Mayhew and his fellow settlers found a large and economically stable native population of about 3,000 living in permanent villages, led by 4 sachems. Relations between the first settlers and the Wampanoag neighbors were peaceful and courteous. Under the leadership of his son, a minister, they instituted a policy of respect and fair dealing with the Wampanoag natives that was unequaled anywhere. One of the first of Mayhew's orders was that no land was to be taken from the native islanders, the Wampanoags, without their consent or without fair payment. For this time forward, the colonial settlers and Indians lived without the bloodshed that marked the history of European colonies elsewhere in the New World. For the beginning, Mayhew had worked to preserve the original political institutions of the Indians. Religion and government were distinct matters, he told the Indian chiefs. When one of your subjects becomes a Christian, he is still under your jurisdiction. Indian land was guarded against further encroachment by white settlers. So successful were these policies that during the bloody battles of King Philip's War in 1675 to 1676, the Vineyard Indians never stirred, although they outnumbered the English on the island by 20 to 1. Spreading religion. By 1660 there were about 85 white people living peaceably among the natives, earning their living by farming and fishing. The Mayhew family, which from the time forth became an integral part of island history, wanted to share its religion with the natives. But the Wampanoags were not too interested, having their own spiritual faith. However, once it was clear that, though Mayhew was the governor, the sachems remained in charge of the people, some became curious about the white man's god. When a native named Hyakums expressed an interest, Mayhew invited him into his home and instructed him in English and Christianity. Hyakums, in return, taught Mayhew the native language. As soon as Mayhew could converse with the natives, he would some days walk 20 miles through uncut forests to preach the gospel, in wigwam or open field. There is a stained glass window in the baptismal font in the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. depicting Rev. Thomas Mayhew Jr. baptizing a native. Change was in the air though, for the world outside this small island was unsettled. There were more visitors from off-island and some stayed, challenging the Mayhew government, while Baptists and Methodists arrived to make converts from the established Congregational Church. From colony to aristocracy, through a maze of conflicting land grants, changing political allegiances, and settler unrest, Mayhew, who styled himself Governor Mayhew, began to rule his island with an iron hand. The most serious threat to his control came in 1665 when Martha's Vineyard was included in the lands placed under the king's brother, the Duke of York. After much delay, a settlement, worked out in 1671, confirmed the Mayhew patent and named Mayhew governor and chief magistrate for life. At the same time, a patent was issued erecting the manor of Disbury in the southwestern part of the island. The governor and his grandson Matthew were made joint lords of the manor of Disbury, and the inhabitants became manorial tenants subject to the feudal jurisdiction of the Mayhews. This full-fledged feudal manor appears to have been the only such institution actually established in New England. The attempt of the Mayhews to create a hereditary aristocracy on the Vineyard met with increasing opposition as more and more colonists arrived. When the Dutch temporarily recaptured New York in 1673, open rebellion broke out, and this lasted until the English regained New York and restored the authority of the Mayhews on the island. The old patriarch died in 1682, at the age of 89. 9 years later the political rule of his family ended when Martha's Vineyard was annexed by Massachusetts after the Glorious Revolution in England, but the manorial land tenure remained. Although some of the Mayhews clung to the pleasant fiction of the manorial rights almost until the American Revolution and received token quit rents as late as 1732, feudalism on Martha's Vineyard died the same slow, lingering but certain death it did elsewhere in the colonies. Missionary work. Kenneth Scott Latourette has concluded that the missionary Mayhews of Martha's Vineyard represent what is probably the longest and most persistent missionary endeavor in the annals of all Christendom. The elder Thomas Mayhew, known for his missionary work, was not concerned for Indian souls when he settled on his island. He sought only to improve his social and economic position. His son, Thomas Mayhew the Younger, is credited with the launching an Indian mission. Like his father, he had emigrated from England. Somewhere, he received a liberal education, apparently from private tutors, and after moving to the Vineyard to begin the white settlement, he became pastor of the small English church as well as acting governor in his father's absence. He soon discovered that he could not refuse the challenge he found among the 3,000 Pokanoques, a branch of the mainland Narragansetts, who far outnumbered the whites, so an effective settlement required friendly relations with the Indians. But Thomas the Younger appears to have been motivated largely by spiritual concern. While his father and other members of the family enjoyed the practical results of the Indian mission, the son gradually abandoned most of his secular tasks and spent the remainder of his life among the natives. Progress was slow at first, but by the end of 1652 there were 283 converts, a school for Indian children, and 2 Indian meetings each Sabbath. The praying Indians of Martha's Vineyard who said grace before meals became a topic of conversation on both sides of the Atlantic. Thomas Mayhew the Younger carried on his missionary work with little heed for his personal fortunes. As the elder Mayhew put it, his son had followed this work when it was bare with him for food and raiment, and when indeed there was nothing in sight anywise but God's promises. The situation was improved somewhat by the formation in 1649 of a London missionary society, usually called the New England Company, which in a few years began to provide substantial aid for the Mayhews and other missionaries. In the fall of 1657, Thomas Mayhew the Younger sailed for England on a trip combining an appeal for missionary funds with personal business. After leaving Boston Harbor, the ship was never seen again. The death of his only son at the age of 36 was a heavy blow to Mayhew and greatly increased the burdens he carried in old age. He made repeated efforts to find a replacement to continue his son's ministry to the Indians, but no minister who knew the language or was willing to learn could be induced to settle permanently on the island. So at the age of 60, Mayhew, who had started as a merchant then turned landed proprietor, became a missionary in his son's place. For the next 25 years he traveled on foot as far as 20 miles to preach once a week at the Indian Assembly or to visit the native camps there. When the venerable Governor Mayhew became ill one Sunday evening in 1682, he calmly informed his friends and relatives that his sickness would now be to death, and he was well contented therewith, being full of days, and satisfied with life. His great-grandson, Experience Mayhew, a son of John, was only 8 at the time, but he clearly remembered being led to the bedside to receive from the dying man a blessing in the name of the Lord. Matthew Mayhew, the eldest grandson, succeeded his military and civil duties. Rev. John Mayhew, the youngest grandson and grandfather of Jonathan Mayhew, continued his missionary work to the Indians. Thomas, another grandson, became a judge of Massachusetts. His descendant Jonathan Mayhew was a prominent 18th-century Boston clergyman who coined the phrase "no taxation without representation." Descendants: Matthew Mayhew, Experience Mayhew, Joseph Mayhew, Jonathan Mayhew, Taylor Swift.